What's going on, guys? My name's Jeremy with J Payne Woodworking, and today I'm going to show you guys how to make a memorial flag case. Now, before we get into this, I really want to put this out there. I am a huge supporter of our military, so thank you guys to all our service members and your families. I know how much of a sacrifice it is for you guys to be out there and protecting our freedoms, so with that being said, thank you so much. This is a project that I was contacted about making, and I was very excited to get to make it, as this is for a gentleman's grandfather's flag. With that in mind, I really wanted to make this kind of above and beyond, and he had a few things he requested that I added into it, and it came out amazing. I am super proud to be a part of this project just because of the fact it is a standing memorial to a gentleman who risked his life to protect the freedoms that sometimes all of us here take for granted. So that being said, let's get into building this thing. I'm going to show you guys how to build it and how it was made. And I got a little twist in it that I added into it that he wound up really liking, and I hope you guys do too. So let's get at it. So I decided to make this out of African mahogany, and it is some beautiful wood and really fun to work with. I started off by cutting the arms of the case to length, and I did not want to dimension just the width of the case. I wanted to dimension the entire board, as I would be using the offcuts from the table saw later on for the front fascia of the case. So in my shop, I do not have a joiner or planer, so I decided to use the I2R8 UCCNC and a bits and bits 1-inch flattening bit, and use this as my thickness planer. Now this worked fantastically. I would rotate out the different sides of the case, but without changing the depth of cut. This would give me the exact same depth of cut on each board and also the same thickness from the CNC bed. Now what this did is gave me the exact same thickness boards across the entire surface of each one of the boards. So this worked really well. And also I wanted to dimension out the entire board before throwing it on the jointer jig and trimming down one edge flush, and this would give me a wide enough scrap piece or secondary piece from the mahogany to use as the front fascia of the case. If you guys do not have a jointer, one of these jointer sleds works awesome. I really love this jig. It allows you to get a perfectly straight, flat edge on one side of your project board to be able to run it through the table saw safely and get an accurate cut. These work really well and they're super easy to make. There's actually another video on my channel showing how to make one of these if you guys are interested. So I took all three pieces of the case and jointed the edge with the jointer sled before turning them over and cutting them to dimension on the table saw. With all of the pieces dimensioned, it was time to add the bevels that would turn this into a triangular case. Now for this, you will need a tenon jig, whether it is one you made or one you purchased. I personally borrowed this one from a friend, as I had not had a chance to make a tenon jig yet, and this Shop Fox tenon jig worked absolutely amazing. I'm really thinking about getting one of these for myself. Now these boards will have two different angles. The base of the triangle will have two cuts at 22.5 degrees, and the top boards will have one cut each at 22.5 degrees, and the peak will be one cut of 45 degrees. This will give you a total of 180 degrees to complete the circle. This is not a regular triangle and does not have equal length sides. That's why you have a difference in the angles at the corners. That being said, take your time while doing these. This can be a very dangerous cut. Make sure to have a proper tenon jig, again, whether it's one you built or one you bought. Either way, make sure it's one you can trust. I was a little curious how well this Metabow table saw was going to make this cut, as cutting through the end grain at this angle is one of the hardest cuts you can make on a saw, and it did a really good job. I slowed down my feed rate and just slowly fed the board through, and it made a nice clean cut all the way through the board with no issues. So this saw really impressed me making this cut, especially in a hardwood like this. Also, another thing to keep in mind is while doing your 45-degree angle cuts, watch the offshoot. As you can see, it moves around and it will get kicked back like that. It will kick back the scrap piece at you, so be careful and make sure not to be in line with that small scrap piece, because that's something that's really difficult and hard to keep from happening. So just make sure to use proper technique and keep vigilant while doing these cuts. So after I got all the bevels cut in, I started getting ready to add in all the custom details. I was going to start by adding the U.S. Army insignia to the top of the case arms, and this is a decorative piece that I'd be filling later on with epoxy. And also, I wanted to add 3 stripes down the edge of the arms, and these would also be filled with a patriotic red, white, and blue epoxy. I thought these would be a really nice touch, and it's something that just makes this case a little more custom and a little more personal. And the I2R8 UCCNC killed it with this. It was extremely accurate and made these cuts extremely fast. I used a Bits and Bits 1/8 inch end mill, and the cuts were really clean, especially with this machine using UCCNC operating controls. I was able to slow down the machine just a tad to get super clean cuts, especially on these detailed pieces like the U.S. Army insignia, and adding in the U.S. Army V-bit star in the center. This was going to give a really cool, unique look to this case, and I was super excited to see how it would come out. And very, very impressed with how well this 90-degree V-bit worked and how accurate this CNC machine is. I really put it through its paces in accuracy this time, and it worked great. I was going to be filling this with epoxy, so I was going to be using KP Pigments for colors and Total Boat tabletop epoxy. Now, figuring out exactly how much epoxy to use in each of these stripes, as well as backfilling the Army insignia, was a little difficult because these are really small amounts and you want to kind of be precise. Another thing I did before pouring the epoxy was coat both of the boards in a satin lacquer and let it dry completely. What this does is creates a barrier to stop the epoxy from seeping into the grains of the wood and bleeding outside of where you want it, so it gives really nice clean lines to the epoxy. If you're doing a pour like this, just take your time. It's a little difficult to get the actual amount perfectly correct. Make sure your boards are setting level and give a few seconds between each of the small pours to allow the epoxy to flatten out so you can see if there is any high or low spots. For the top piece with the Army insignia, I decided I was just going to kind of overfill it, and with the lacquer spray to the board, it would stop it from going into the grains, and just use a paint scraper to slide off the excess and give a nice level surface, as well as filling in all the small cracks and crevices around the Army insignia. Let the boards dry completely, which takes about 8 hours or a little more for the tabletop epoxy. I waited an entire day and did some of the rough sanding just to see if there was any spots that I needed to add a little extra epoxy to or any issues I needed to fix. I then moved on to this custom acrylic plate I was going to be making for the gentleman's grandfather, and this would be just a little bit of a memorial piece for his grandfather, and it's not something that's necessary for the case, but I thought it would be a nice touch. This diamond drag bit was really interesting to watch work. It's super accurate, and it just drags a small diamond across the surface and will engrave it that way. And you'll see in a little while, once I add this little surprise, what this effect really does. Once the engraving was finished, I used the miter saw to cut the plate to size to ensure it would have a uniform size all the way around. So I've got this really cool little acrylic plate, or I think this is actually Lexan, but same thing pretty much. Anyway, I used the diamond drag bit to engrave all of this lettering in. It looks really, really nice. I'm really happy with how that came out. Now, one thing when you're working with like Lexan or acrylic, you'll notice that the edges, and I'll get a better shot of this, hopefully. The edges here are really rough. They're not very clear. Now, this is going to have a little surprise at the end, so I want all of these edges to be really, really clear. So I'm gonna attempt a little trick I learned, and I'm gonna let you guys check it out, and hopefully it works. We don't destroy this thing and have to make another one. So. Now that the sides of the acrylic plate are all cleared up, it's time to glue all of the pieces of the case into place. I was using a technique of laying tape down and then laying the boards onto the tape, and then applying a liberal amount of Titebond glue to all of the joints, and then pretty much just placing everything in place and tightening the tape down around it. This tape will hold it securely in place and ensure that it won't move around while the glue dries up. While the glue on the case was drying, I went ahead and started cutting to dimension the front fascia. This would be the pieces in the front of the case that hold the flag in place and do not allow it to fall out of the front of the case. These are the offcut pieces that were made earlier on the table saw, and it was just a matter of using the table saw to cut these to width to be able to lay them into place. Once the pieces were cut to dimension, I used the miter gauge on the table saw to cut in the bevels. Now again, make sure you're referencing off of the correct face or your bevels will be incorrect and will not lay flat against the front of the case, or you will have visible seams. Alright guys, so I wanted to show you this piece, particularly how I got this front fascia together. I'm going to put it together with tape here, and then I'm going to glue it to the front. I've got the tape here pretty much to hold it together, hold it in this shape perfectly, so I can lift it directly up, apply some glue, set it back down, and then clamp it all together, and that should have that. And I'm going to let that dry, and then there's going to be a front fascia piece right here. So this large piece here is actually going to be like this, and there will be some engraving here, and it will be cut to kind of match right here and everything. So it's going to look really, really nice. I just needed to build this, and then also I'm going to be adding a little surprise in the way of some LEDs, I think maybe. It should look really, really nice. So now I'm going to go ahead and get this glued up. I let the glue set at least overnight before undoing the clamps, and I had a lot going on and was trying to get the engraving for the front face plate to get done, so I called in a little help. But yeah, a couple of these idiots just wanted to kind of goof off the whole day, so Didn't really get a whole lot done with these guys, but I did get the case out of the clamps and all of the tape off of the case so I could start on to the next process of preparing the front face of the case and getting it engraved and starting with the sanding process. So I'm going to go fire these guys and get back to work. As with most projects where you glue something up, there's always a little bit of cleanup, so I used a chisel to clean up some of the excess glue and make the sanding process go a little bit easier. With some of the rough sanding done, I went back to the CNC to create this personalized front plate. Now this front plate is going to serve a couple of different purposes. The first is add a really nice personalized touch to the case, and also it's going to serve as a cover for the front of the case. No matter how tight your seams are on an angle like this, it's really difficult to get the grains to pretty much coincide and make the seam disappear. So this will cover the lower two seams on the triangle, and I will be adding another piece later to cover the peak seam. With the engraving done, I took the piece and cleared it with some satin lacquer and allowed that to dry. Just like with the epoxy, this creates a solid barrier between the paint and the wood. This will allow me to spray a colored paint into the engraving to give it some contrast and come back later and sand off all the excess on the top without the paint bleaching or seeping into the grains of the wood. I also then went back to the CNC and cut out a back for the case. I did this out of 1/4 inch MDF and added a nice little quote to the back of it, and then started prepping by marking where I wanted the mounting points to be. This was going to be 2 small steel studs that stick out the back, then allow you to press the back onto these studs, and then it will be held in place at the top with a neodymium magnet. I started by marking the position of the slots and then drilling 2 1/8 inch holes into the slots, and then using the bandsaw just to square them off and open up the ends of them. This would allow a nice tight slot for the steel stud to catch the back of the case. To install the studs, I started off with a little bit of Starbond thick clear adhesive and put it in the holes that had been made before. Now these were cut into the back and the back of the case at the same time, so I knew these would line up perfectly on the back of the case. Now another thing I wanted to do is make sure that when the back of the case was in place, that these studs set flush. So I used the back of the case as a bit of a guide of depth to drive down the stud into place. To mount the neodymium magnet, I started with a very small drill bit to give a very tiny pilot hole. This would do 2 things. This would allow for a pilot hole for the Forstner bit to get the perfect sized hole, and it would also give me the exact placement for the neodymium magnet. This would make sure that the magnet lines up not only on the back of the case but on the backing board as well. With the placement holes for the magnets in place, I went back to the front fascia and sanded off the excess paint. As you can see, the lacquer did its job perfectly, and it stopped the paint from seeping into the grains of the wood and causing small black specks, so it worked really, really well. Now it was time to start placing the front fascia into place. The first things I needed to do was mark the center line where it would be placed at the end, and then mark the angles that I need to cut on the ends of the fascia to line up with the outside of the case. Then I went to the miter saw and followed these guidelines so that the front fascia would fit perfectly. I was going to be installing this with a little bit of glue on the front and then using some small brad nails to hold it into place while the glue cures. I also decided to add a couple of clamps on the very ends of the front fascia, and this would just tighten up those outer seams and make them good and flush against the outside of the case. Once the glue had dried, I went ahead and installed the neodymium magnets both into the case and into the backer board. I used some Starbond adhesive to place these into the holes that we drilled earlier, and this worked really well and held them securely into place. It's now time to test the fit, so I simply slide the back board slots down over the pins and it is held into place by the magnet. I then went back to the CNC and created a small patch that would cover the front seam at the peak of the case. This would cover the seam and also add a nice little personal touch, as this was the Army Star insignia, and I thought it would just add a super clean look, as the case on the front just was missing something. After cutting it out on the CNC, I used the orbital sander just to clean up the edges and the front before going back to doing most of the final sanding on the case. The reason I wanted to do the final sanding before adding this patch was due to the fact once the patch was in place, it would be more difficult to reach some of the edges around the front of the case. So I sanded up to 600 grit with the orbital sander and then went back and wet sanded up to around 6,000 grit on the epoxy. I then started marking out and laying out the positioning for the small acrylic plate that had been engraved earlier. I wanted it perfectly in the center of the opening of the case, so this took a little bit of time and just watching my different measurements to make sure to line it up dead center and give it the best look. I also added a couple of marks on the front, and this would just give me ley lines as well as marks on the back that would give me the appropriate place to mount the acrylic plate. Before mounting the acrylic plate, I went ahead and mounted the LEDs into place. This would also allow for me to give the perfect height to the acrylic plate so that the LEDs could shine through it and give it a really nice look and a really nice effect. I then used Starbond adhesives to glue the acrylic plate into place. I also came back later on and added a couple of small flat screws just to hold the acrylic plate into place just a little better, so I did not have to worry about it during shipping, as well as making it removable in case you ever need to remove it to clean it up, or if you needed to replace the LEDs, you could move it out of your way beforehand. For finishing, I was going to be using Danish oil. Just flood the wood surfaces of the case with Danish oil and a brush. Wait about 15 to 20 minutes, wipe it away, and then repeat this process. Make sure to tape off the acrylic plate if you have one, as you do not want it on the plate. But beyond that, this is a super simple process and gives a beautiful color to this mahogany. So there it is, guys, the finished flag case. Let me know in the comments what you think about it. I love it. I really do. The mahogany looks great. It's not something I've worked with much, but now that I've worked with it, I really want to work with it more. It's a great wood to work with, and it turned out absolutely beautiful in my opinion. So let me know in the comments what you guys think of it. That being said, to the gentleman this is going to, his grandfather's flag will be housed in this. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make this case. I know it's going to mean a lot to you. It actually means a lot to me, even though I'm not related to you guys. And I just would like to say thank you as the family of the service member, and thank everybody who is in the service and in the military and your families. I know it's a huge sacrifice, and these men and women are out here braving all of these insanely dangerous situations to protect the freedoms that people like me get to take advantage of every single day. And I think that's kind of forgotten, and that is taken for granted sometimes. So with that in mind, to everyone in the military, all of your family, thank every one of you for your sacrifice. From the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate it. So if you guys like this video, make sure to hit that like button and make sure you subscribe. It really helps me grow and keep putting out content like this. Also, if you want to check out some of the other stuff that I've got going on and kind of check in on a regular basis, go check out my Instagram at jpaynewoodworking. And also, the plans for this will be up in the next few days after the release, or hopefully when this releases within a day or so, to build your own. You can check those out at jpaynewoodworking.com. And again, thank you guys so much. This meant a lot to me, but it's on to the next one. So we'll see you guys later. Peace.